Rostov-on-Don, Russia, October 1982. A special task force is desperately searching for a serial killer. The investigation had begun 4 months earlier when the body of a 13-year-old girl was found in a desolate patch of forest. She had been stabbed repeatedly. Her eyes had been gouged out.
There's a Russian superstition that the last sight that a murder victim sees is somehow imprinted on the surface of the eye.
Soon, 2 more bodies with similar wounds were discovered. All 3 had been sexually assaulted.
All the bodies were found in the woods near the railway tracks in the Oktябrьsky and Shakhty districts.
At first, the brutal and ritualistic nature of the killings led police to suspect a satanic cult was at work, or a group harvesting organs to sell for transplant. Police also wondered if a gang of boys from a local home for the mentally handicapped might be responsible. They dubbed the investigation the Case of Fools. None of these theories panned out. In the Soviet era, local investigators were not prepared to understand the brutal nature of the killings.
They had not dealt with anyone of his caliber before. They were reluctant to admit that things like this would occur in a communist state.
The best they could do was gather bits of evidence.
We got down to serious work, first of all, with the identification of the bodies and then forensic tests of the remains.
Despite these efforts, the body count rose.
By 1984, we had found 23 bodies. Some of the bodies were still fresh, which gave us a broader picture of the injuries and the killer's behavior at the site of crime.
Many of the victims were young girls and boys who had been discovered in the wooded areas around Rostov. All had been mutilated.
When they found some of the victims, you could still see the reflection of horror in their eyes. It was very hard to look at because many were just children. There were cut abdomens, amputated breasts. It was horrible to see.
And in many cases, it was clear that those body parts had been removed by the teeth of the killer.
A lot of the bodies were found near transportation points, bus stations, train stations in particular, which indicated that the killer, whoever he was somebody who used the Soviet transportation system extensively.
Despite clear evidence that a serial killer was on the loose, Soviet police and the Communist Party-controlled media refused to release any information. In the absence of real facts, rumors spread throughout the region.
There were rumors of people with state black limousines, scarfing up children in the countryside. But in the absence of any real media, these children disappeared and nobody knew that they had gone.
With no solid suspects, Rostov police began a wide-ranging manhunt, arresting nearly anyone who looked even vaguely suspicious.
They had a lot of manpower, and they deployed dozens and dozens of detectives trying to come up with suspects.
But for 8 years, the killer remained at large.
Initially, his victims tended to come more from the ranks of what they called women with disorderly sex lives. As time went on, he started to take more and more boys, innocent children, whoever he could lure and kill.
He chose children whose physical stature made it easy for them to be manipulated. He chose prostitutes who were willing to go with a stranger.
Police focused their efforts on transportation hubs.
They put very high-profile police officers, uniforms, etc., in all but a few train stations or bus stations.
All the large stations were patrolled by policemen in uniform. We were trying to play on the criminal's emotions and drive him into an isolated location.
Undercover officers were used to keep these remote locations under surveillance. In early November, the strategy paid off. A plainclothes detective at an isolated train station spotted a man emerging from the woods. The officer noticed a smear of blood on his cheek and what appeared to be a severe cut on his finger.
According to the policeman who was watching him, the suspect washed his shoes and cleaned his coat. The policeman in civilian clothes asked him to show his papers.
He identified himself as Andrei Chikatilo, a 54-year-old grandfather and loyal Communist Party member. The detective did not have enough reason to hold Chikatilo. He did, however, file a report on the incident. 24 hours later, a passerby discovered a girl's body in the same woods.
It happened the next day after Chikatilo had been stopped on the platform. The body had all the typical injuries on it. The chief of police immediately demanded the files of any suspicious individuals who were registered in the last 24 hours.
On November 20th, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was apprehended in a Rostov marketplace. Investigators captured the arrest on video.
He had come out of the pub with a bottle of beer and tried to make contact with a young boy. We suspected that he might try to lure the boy away. And at that point, Chikatilo was arrested.
By now, Chikatilo was suspected of committing more than 30 murders, but the police had no eyewitness and few real clues. Detectives desperately needed proof of his guilt. They needed a confession.
They wanted to get the confession. If you read Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, I think that you'll see that the confession is a very powerful symbol and very powerful element in Russian culture.
Soon, Andrei Chikatilo would reveal the gruesome details of his 12-year run as a sexual predator. It was a tale that would shock a nation.
In the annals of crime, Andrei Chikatilo is undoubtedly one of the most sadistic killers ever to live, and he got away with murder for more than 12 years.
November 1990. Police in Rostov-on-Don, Russia, were interrogating suspected serial killer Andrei Chikatilo. For 12 years, a sadistic killer had raped and murdered dozens of women and children. Authorities believed Chikatilo was the culprit. But so far, the father of two had admitted nothing. By law, authorities had 10 days to link him to the murders. Otherwise, Chikatilo would go free.
On the 9th day, we invited the psychiatrist Bukhanovsky to talk to Chikatilo one-on-one. He spent the whole day with Chikatilo from early morning till very late at night.
The techniques used by psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky were much different than the intense police interrogation.
I explained I wasn't his enemy, although not a defender either. In the medical language, there are no words like guilty and wrong. I wasn't his judge, but just a doctor.
Chikatilo opened up to Bukhanovsky. After several hours of conversation, he began to confess his crimes.
He probably, in some respects, wanted to be caught. I can't imagine somebody doing that for all those many years and not realizing that he was living in a hell of his own creation and wanting to be out of it.
He took even a kind of smarmy, perverse pride in demonstrating his various techniques, which he did in the KGB gymnasium, where little dummies were used to represent the victims.
Not only did Chikatilo admit to the 36 murders of which police were aware, he also described 17 more that they hadn't tied to him.
From then we began to collect evidence to prove his connection to the other murders.
Или брюки только спущены. Нет, как, ага, я вот не понял это. Он в это время одежда у него...
Chikatilo was more than willing to show how he disarmed people, how he tricked them, how he tied up the boys, how he inflicted the knife wounds, and how he even had sexual relations with his victims, either in the stage of near death or after death.
What we do know about the serial killer is when you start to talk with them, they hold everything together. Then they begin to disintegrate, and they begin to be able to share bits, pieces, odds and ends of murders.
On the evening of December 7th, 1990, police drove Chikatilo to the local village of Shakhty. Again, one of the officers had a video camera. Walking between the gravestones of a small public cemetery, Chikatilo brought them to the site of a shallow, unmarked grave. Police dug until finally a child's sneaker emerged through the earth. Chikatilo watched casually, detached from the proceedings. But these horrors would shock the Soviet nation. What could have created this brutal killer? How could he have killed so many for so long?
What would cause a person to slip over that line and become a serial offender of any kind?
Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo had started life in a world of violence and human degradation. He was born in 1936 in the Ukrainian village of Yablachnoye. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist, and famines devastated the Ukrainian people.
There were serious food shortages in Ukraine, partly as a result of the devastation of the war, and partly as a result of the agricultural policies of the Stalin-era Soviet Union.
Under the banner of collectivism, Stalin forced peasant farmers to deliver their entire crops to the state for nationwide distribution. In the Ukraine itself, however, people were starving.
There were outbreaks of mass cannibalism in Russia that were caused simply by hunger.
Reports of cannibalism became so frequent, they developed into a kind of folklore.
A typical family cannibalism story. My aunt was arrested because she had somebody over for a meal, and there were fingertips floating in the soup.
As a young boy, Andrei's own mother told him such a grim tale about a horrific event that had supposedly happened just before he was born.
His mother used to tell him stories that his older brother was cannibalized because of the famine that was taking place.
She constantly used it as a warning: don't go out and play after it's dark. They'll grab you and eat you just like they did to your brother Stepan.
Her claim that his brother had been cannibalized was impossible to confirm, but psychiatrists speculate that Chikatilo himself might have been traumatized by another crime, an assault on his mother.
His sister was born in 1943 during a time when the Germans were occupying a large part of Ukraine where he lived. And his father was supposedly in the Red Army at the time. It's hard to imagine how the father could have gotten back to the family home to impregnate the mother. And they had a one-room home. So it's quite possible that he saw a German soldier rape his mother.
Also devastating in the eyes of 13-year-old Andrei was the fate of his father, taken prisoner by the Nazis. When Chikatilo's father finally returned home in 1949, he was suffering from tuberculosis. Rather than being rewarded for his war service, he was branded a traitor to the Soviet government.
You either died in battle or you triumphed, and there was no third way that was honorable. Stalin's paranoia was such that soldiers who were captured by the Germans and held captive were considered suspect.
Although the Communist Party made Andrei's father an outcast, Andrei's own devotion to the state was such that as a young teen, he became an active member of the Communist Youth League.
Chikatilo was very genuine in his belief, in his professed public belief in communism.
But with the onset of puberty, young Andrei realized that he was not like the other boys in the Youth League.
He never fit in very well, and he felt embarrassed and humiliated generally about his lack of sexual prowess.
His social circle consisted of much younger children, with whom he felt comfortable because they understood him, or elderly people who liked him because he was always a good boy.
As a teenager, Andrei was attracted to young girls, but he was humiliated when he found himself unable to perform sexually.
At that point, he was probably as attractive a man as he was ever going to be, and started having courtship with a girl in the village. And his impotence destroyed that relationship. It became a subject of gossip in the village.
It was yet another insult to Chikatilo's fragile self-image, and a discovery that would torment him all of his life. By 1955, Andrei Chikatilo was desperate to escape Ukraine and memories of a miserable youth. By his late teens, Andrei knew that he was sexually inadequate. To compensate, Chikatilo decided to better himself in other ways. He set his sights on the prestigious Moscow University, hoping to earn a law degree. But he failed the entrance exam. Disappointed, he entered a vocational school.
He wanted to believe in himself as a person who had studied hard, which he in fact had, and gotten a university degree. Not an insignificant accomplishment given his origins.
That was another layer of acceptability, if you will, another layer to cover up what really existed with Chikatilo.
In 1963, at the urging of his younger sister, the 28-year-old Chikatilo married.
He was living with his sister, and she had a spinster friend, and the two of them were put together, and having no better prospects, they married.
His new wife, Feodosia, was a 24-year-old daughter of a coal miner.
At last he had found a person in life with whom he could communicate and relate and have something approaching normal emotional closeness.
He never was capable of normal sexual relations with her, but there was, through a kind of masturbation and insemination process, an effort made to conceive children.
In 1965, they were successful. The birth of their daughter, Luda, was followed by a son, Yura, 4 years later. Chikatilo found work as a communications technician. Throughout this time, he continued his studies, working towards degrees in Marxist-Leninism, engineering, and Russian literature. The family had a balconied second-floor flat in a nondescript block. By Russian standards, it was a pleasant life. Outwardly, Andrei was a good husband and father. Feodosia had little reason to complain.
She might have felt, well, he's a party member, he brings home a salary, he's not drunk, and he doesn't beat me. Those last two things would set him apart in a favorable way from a lot of men in the Soviet Union.
His marriage, his children, his membership in the Communist Party, that's what everyone saw. But that wasn't his true personality.
Chikatilo had erected a modest and respectable facade for the world to see. Inside, however, he was desperately frustrated.
Certainly the fact that he was fundamentally impotent enraged him greatly because he felt that in some ways he was a superior person, having gotten 3 university degrees.
I think he felt throughout his life that that impotence was probably the most fundamental adjective you could use to describe him.
In 1970, Chikatilo accepted a job in a secondary school. As a teacher, the 34-year-old hoped to find acceptance and respect, and yet instead he found constant humiliation. His students didn't take him seriously. They refused to behave and smoked right in front of him in the classroom.
He was altogether not the kind of person that would hold the attention of a class of children, and they mocked him.
He was nicknamed the Goose by his students, and goose in Russian is kind of like jerk in English. It's someone who inspires zero respect.
Worse, Chikatilo found himself enraged by the sight of young people around him falling in love and, in his mind, engaging in sexual activity.
One thing that he wanted to change about himself and couldn't change was his sexual impotence.
He felt the world had somehow inflicted a tremendous injustice on him. Any lowlife could enjoy the pleasures of sexuality, the joys of love, but he, Chikatilo, the educated, the brilliant, the special, the genius, could not, and that was a source of his fundamental rage.
In the early 1970s, Chikatilo responded to his anger and frustration by secretly molesting students, both male and female.
He felt so profoundly rejected by adults, he was unable to have sexual relationships with consenting adults, so he instead went to vulnerable children.
In 1974, he was fired when allegations of his sexual misconduct with students became known.
Rather than take the responsibility for exposing him, the director of the school simply got rid of him. And it was typical of what might happen in a Soviet society, and probably would happen in any society.
Because the incidents were kept quiet, Chikatilo could simply relocate. He moved his family to the nearby town of Shakhty. There he found a new position, teaching at vocational school number 33.
Chikatilo's wife knew that he had little problems. He was involved with bothering the children at school, but they had put that behind them, and she had forgiven her husband.
But unknown to his wife and family, Andrei Chikatilo was constructing another life. He bought a second secret house for himself. It was a dilapidated 3-room shack on a quiet back street called Mezhevoy Lane. And it was the perfect setting for murder.